This is cold.
Priscilla, it's fine. Eat.
Excuse me.
Yes, ma'am? How can I help you?
You can start by explaining why my food is ice cold and I've been sitting here for 20 minutes waiting for someone to clear this table.
I apologize for the delay. I'll take care of it right now.
Don't touch anything until you look at me when I'm talking to you.
I'm listening, ma'am.
You people act like you're doing us a favor just showing up. Do you know how much this table cost?
No, ma'am, I don't.
Maybe if you dressed like a professional, you'd finally learn how to act like one.
Priscilla!
Boy!
Thank you for sharing your feelings, ma'am. I hope the rest of your evening improves.
He had poured wine for men who wouldn't have hired him to sweep their floors. He had smiled through insults that would have broken a lesser man's spirit. But when the CEO's fiancée grabbed his collar and tore his uniform in front of 300 of New York's wealthiest guests, laughing as she called him boy, she had no idea that the quiet black waiter she just humiliated was about to become the most powerful man in that entire ballroom. What happened in the next 10 minutes would end her engagement, cost the CEO his company, and remind everyone in that room what real dignity looks like. Before we delve further, let us know in the comments where you are watching from and what time it is at your location. We want to know how far our story travels. The Whitmore Grand Ballroom on Park Avenue glittered that October evening. Crystal chandeliers threw soft gold light over round tables dressed in ivory linen, and a string quartet played something quiet and elegant near the far wall. It was the annual Children's Hope Gala, the kind of event where a single centerpiece cost more than most people's monthly rent, and where 300 of the city's wealthiest men and women gathered once a year to write checks and congratulate themselves on their generosity. Among the servers moving quietly through the crowd, refilling glasses and offering trays of hors d'oeuvres, was a tall man named Solomon Ashworth Reeves. He was 58 years old, with silver threading through his close-cropped hair, and the kind of calm, steady presence that made people trust him without knowing why. He moved through the ballroom the way he'd moved through every room of his life. Unhurried, attentive, dignified. Nobody at that gala knew his name. To them, he was simply the waiter. A tall black man in a black vest and white shirt, invisible in the way that service staff often are, to people who have never had to serve anyone. What none of them knew, what none of them could have imagined, was that Solomon had spent 31 years as a respected federal judge before retiring 2 years earlier. He had sat on the bench in Manhattan, presided over cases that made the evening news, and shaken hands with senators and mayors. He had raised 2 children who were now a surgeon and a civil rights attorney. He had buried his beloved wife Adeline 18 months earlier after 40 years of marriage, and in the quiet, aching months that followed, he had found himself restless in his empty house, unsure what to do with his hands or his days. A friend from his old parish had mentioned that a catering company needed extra staff for the busy gala season. Solomon, who had grown up the son of a hotel doorman in Baltimore, and never forgotten the dignity his father carried in that uniform, decided to take the work. Not because he needed the money, his pension and investments left him comfortable, but because he needed purpose. He needed to be around people, even if they didn't know who he was. There was something almost peaceful about being unseen. No one asking about his loss. No one offering pity. Just quiet, useful work. His daughter, Yolanda, had laughed when he told her, "Daddy, you were a federal judge. You don't need to carry trays." "I don't need to," he'd told her, smiling. I want to. There's honest work in service, baby girl. Your grandfather taught me that a man's worth isn't measured by the job he holds, but by how he holds it. So there he stood that October evening, tray balanced on one steady hand, watching the room the way he'd once watched a courtroom, quietly, carefully, missing nothing. Near the center of the room, holding court at the most prominent table, sat Desmond Halloway, the 39-year-old CEO of Halloway Capital Partners, one of the fastest-growing investment firms in the country. He was handsome in a sharp, expensive way, the kind of man who filled every room with his voice before he'd even said anything of substance. Beside him sat his fiancée, Priscilla Ainsworth Vance, a former beauty pageant queen turned social media influencer, dripping in diamonds that caught the chandelier light every time she moved her wrist, which was often. Priscilla had built her entire identity around being looked at. She'd grown up believing that beauty and money were the only currencies that mattered, and by 29, she'd accumulated plenty of both, along with a well-earned reputation among the waitstaff at every event in the city. She was, in the quiet words of the catering manager, one to watch. That night, Priscilla had been drinking steadily since the cocktail hour. By the time the dinner service began, her voice had climbed several notches too loud, and her patience had worn to nothing. It started small. She snapped her fingers at a server for more champagne. She complained loudly that her filet was practically raw when it was in fact cooked precisely as she'd ordered. She made a comment about the help not being fast enough. Then Solomon approached her table to clear the salad plates. "Excuse me," he said gently, reaching for her plate. Priscilla turned, saw the tray in his hands, and something in her, perhaps the wine, perhaps years of never once being told no, snapped. "Finally," she said loudly, her voice cutting through the quiet murmur of the room. "Do you know how long I've been waiting? Is this some kind of joke? Did they just pull people off the street to work this event?" Solomon kept his voice even. "I apologize for the wait, ma'am. Let me get that cleared for you right away." "Don't ma'am me," she snapped, standing now, wobbling slightly on her heels. "I want to speak to whoever hired you people. This is supposed to be a 5-star event, and I've got some boy fumbling around my table like he's never held a tray in his life." The word landed hard. A few guests nearby stiffened. Desmond, to his credit, reached for her arm. "Priscilla, sit down. You're making a scene." "I don't care," she said, jerking away from him. "I'm so tired of paying for events where the staff can't even do their one job right." And then, in a moment that would replay in whispered conversations across Manhattan for weeks afterward, Priscilla
No,
reached
ma'am,
out,
I don't.
grabbed the front of Solomon's black vest,
Priscilla!
and yanked. The fabric tore at the seam with a sharp ripping sound that seemed to echo across the sudden silence of the ballroom. Buttons scattered and rolled across the marble floor. "Maybe if you're not dressed like a professional," she said, her voice shaking with fury and wine, "you'll finally learn to act like one." The room had gone utterly still. 300 guests, forks frozen halfway to their mouths, stared at the scene unfolding at the Halloway table. Somewhere near the back, a woman gasped audibly. The string quartet, sensing the shift in the room, let their final note fade into silence. Solomon stood there for a moment, his torn vest hanging open, his shirt beneath it slightly rumpled but his posture unchanged, still straight, still composed, still carrying himself with the same quiet dignity he'd carried into courtrooms for 3 decades. He did not raise his voice. He did not reach for her. He simply looked at her, steady and calm, and said, "Thank you for sharing your feelings, ma'am. I hope the rest of your evening improves." Then he bent, gathered the fallen buttons from the floor with quiet composure, straightened, and walked toward the kitchen without another word. What Priscilla didn't know, what almost no one in that room knew, except for a small handful of the Gala's organizing committee, was that the event's guest of honor that evening, the woman who had personally funded the children's wing at Lenox Hill Hospital and whose foundation had donated $11 million to youth education programs over the past decade, was a woman named Vivian Odette Reeves, Solomon's daughter-in-law, no, his late wife's closest friend, and the executor of the family's charitable foundation, a woman who had known Solomon for over 20 years and treated him like a brother. Vivian had been seated at the head table near the stage, deep in conversation with the hospital's chief of pediatric medicine, when the commotion broke out. She turned just in time to see Solomon's vest tear, to hear the word boy cut across the room, and to watch the quiet, composed way he'd handled an act of public cruelty that would have made most people either weep or explode with rage. Vivian set down her wineglass very slowly. She stood, smoothed her gown, and walked directly toward the small stage at the front of the ballroom, where the event's MC stood holding a cordless microphone, clearly uncertain whether to continue the program after what had just happened. "May I?" Vivian asked, extending her hand for the microphone. The MC, recognizing her instantly, handed it over without hesitation. The room's attention, already fixed on the aftermath of the scene, turned fully toward the stage. Vivienne stood there for a long moment, letting the silence settle, her gaze sweeping calmly across the crowd before landing, briefly and pointedly, on Priscilla, who had gone pale and was now gripping the edge of the table. "Good evening," Vivienne began, her voice steady and clear. "For those who don't know me, my name is Vivian Reeves. I chair the foundation that organized tonight's gala, and every dollar raised here goes directly toward pediatric care and education for children who have nothing, no wealth, no name, no advantage except the kindness of people willing to see their worth." She paused. "I want to tell you about a man," she continued. 31 years ago, this man put on a robe every single day and walked into a courtroom in this city, and he made decisions that changed people's lives. He sent violent men to prison. He gave second chances to young people who deserved them. He was, by every account of every attorney who ever stood before him, one of the fairest and most respected judges this state has ever produced. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Guests began glancing toward the kitchen doors, toward each other, putting pieces together. After he retired, Vivian went on, he lost his wife of 40 years to illness, and in his grief, he found that what he needed most wasn't rest. It was purpose. It was the simple dignity of useful work. So he took a job serving at events like this one, not because he needed the money, but because he refused to let grief make him idle, and because he believed, as he always has, that no honest work is beneath a man of character. She let that settle before continuing. "Tonight, in this room, in front of all of you, that man, the Honorable Solomon Ashworth Reeves, retired judge of the United States District Court, had his uniform torn from his body and was called boy by a woman who decided, based entirely on the color of his skin and the tray in his hands, that he was beneath her respect." Gasps rippled through the crowd now, more audible this time. Several guests turned sharply toward Priscilla, whose face had drained of all color. Desmond had gone rigid beside her, his jaw tight. "I have known Judge Reeves for over 20 years, Vivian said. "I have watched him show more grace and more patience in this last hour than most people manage in a lifetime. And I think it's worth asking ourselves, all of us, sitting here in our finery, supporting a cause built on compassion for children who have nothing. What kind of example are we setting when a woman at this very gala treats a fellow human being the way we just witnessed? She turned to the kitchen doors. Judge Reeves, would you do me the honor of joining me? Solomon emerged from the kitchen a few minutes later. He had changed into a spare white shirt one of the kitchen staff had found for him, though he still wore his black trousers and, notably, had declined a replacement vest, choosing instead to walk out exactly as he was, a tall, composed man in simple attire, carrying himself with the unmistakable bearing of someone who had spent a lifetime commanding respect through conduct, not costume. The applause started slowly, a few hands at first, uncertain, and then built, table by table, until the entire ballroom rose to its feet. 300 people, many of them powerful, wealthy, accustomed to being the ones applauded, stood clapping for a man they had, moments before, walked past without a second glance. Solomon reached the stage and accepted the microphone from Vivian with a small, gracious nod. He waited for the applause to quiet before speaking, his voice measured and calm, the same voice that had once read verdicts in a federal courtroom. "Please, sit," he said. "There's no need for all this." The room slowly settled, though the energy remained charged, electric with tension and shame and curiosity all at once. "I want to say a few things," Solomon began, "and then I'd like for us to get back to why we're actually here tonight. The children this foundation serves." He looked out over the crowd, his eyes calm. "I've worn a lot of different clothes in my life," he said. "A judge's robe, a father's Sunday suit, tonight, a caterer's vest. And I'll tell you something my own father taught me. A man who spent 38 years opening doors for wealthy families at a hotel not far from here." He paused, letting the memory settle in his own chest before continuing. "My father used to say, 'Solomon, a uniform tells people what job you're doing. It doesn't tell them who you are. Only your character does that.' I've carried that with me my whole life, through law school, through 31 years on the bench, and yes, through tonight, standing at that table with my vest torn open." He let his gaze move, briefly and without malice, toward Priscilla, who sat frozen, tears now streaking down her carefully applied makeup. "I'm not interested in humiliating anyone," Solomon continued. "I've spent too many years in courtrooms watching what humiliation does to people, how it hardens them instead of teaching them. So I'm not going to stand up here and tell you all how angry I am, though I imagine some of you might expect that." He took a slow breath. "What I will say is this. Somewhere in this city tonight, there's a young man about my grandson's age, working his first catering job to help pay for community college, hoping to become an engineer. There's a young woman clearing plates at another gala across town, saving every dollar to send home to her mother. They are not beneath anyone in this room. They are not invisible. They are not defined by the tray in their hands, any more than any of you are defined by the tables you're sitting at tonight." His voice remained gentle, but carried an unmistakable weight, the kind that came from 3 decades of being listened to in rooms far more serious than this one. "So my ask tonight isn't for an apology, though I imagine one may be coming." He glanced, not unkindly, toward Priscilla. "My ask is simpler. The next time any of you are served by someone, at a gala, at a restaurant, in a hospital, anywhere, I hope you'll remember this evening. I hope you'll remember that the person holding the tray might be a judge, might be a teacher, might be someone's beloved father or mother, working an honest job with an honest heart. And even if they're none of those things, even if they're simply a person doing their job to feed their family, that alone makes them worthy of your respect." He handed the microphone back to Vivian, gave the room a small, dignified nod, and stepped down from the stage. The applause this time was different, quieter, but somehow deeper, more genuine, the kind that comes not from spectacle, but from something that has actually moved people. What happened next unfolded over the following weeks, quietly but decisively, the way real consequences often do, not with a single dramatic explosion, but with a slow and steady unraveling. By the following morning, a video taken by a guest's phone, shaky but clear enough, had made its way onto social media. It showed the moment Priscilla tore Solomon's vest, though not, notably, the word she'd used, which several witnesses later confirmed to reporters independently. It showed Solomon's calm response, and it showed, in the background, Vivian rising from her seat. The story spread quickly, not because of manufactured outrage, but because it touched something real. The quiet, universal recognition of dignity under pressure, and the discomfort of watching cruelty meet grace instead of anger. Desmond Holloway's investment firm, which managed retirement funds and pension accounts for several municipal employee unions, found itself facing uncomfortable questions within days. Two of the firm's largest institutional clients, pension funds representing thousands of city workers, many of them Black and Latino civil servants, quietly began reviewing their contracts. Within 3 weeks, both funds had withdrawn their business, citing reputational concerns in carefully worded statements that everyone understood the meaning of. Desmond, facing mounting pressure from his own board of directors, released a public statement expressing his deep regret over the incident and announcing a substantial donation to Judge Reeves' preferred charity, the same scholarship fund, in fact, that Solomon had quietly supported for years, one that helped first-generation college students from working-class families in Baltimore, not far from where Solomon himself had grown up. Priscilla's engagement to Desmond ended within the month, announced through a brief statement from her publicist that mentioned nothing of the gala. Her social media following, which had once numbered in the hundreds of thousands, dropped sharply as brand partnerships quietly dissolved one by one. 6 weeks after the gala, she released a public apology, not on television, not through a publicist's carefully worded statement, but in a letter addressed directly to Solomon, delivered to Vivian's foundation office, and forwarded to him with his permission. Solomon read it alone, in his kitchen, on a quiet Tuesday morning, with his coffee going cold beside him. "Judge Reeves," it began, "I have started this letter more times than I can count, because I don't know how to apologize for something I still don't fully understand about myself. Why I felt entitled to treat you the way I did. I was raised to believe that money and beauty meant I never had to answer to anyone. That night, in front of all those people, you answered me with more grace than I've shown anyone in my entire life. I don't expect forgiveness. I only wanted you to know that what you said on that stage has stayed with me every day since. I am in therapy now, working to understand where that cruelty came from, so I never become that woman again. I am deeply, sincerely sorry." Solomon folded the letter carefully and set it on the counter. He thought for a long while, the way he used to think before delivering a verdict, weighing not just the facts, but the person behind them. He wrote back 3 sentences. "Thank you for your honesty. Growth is rarely comfortable, but it is always worthwhile. I wish you well on the road ahead." He did not require groveling. He did not need a public spectacle of contrition. He had spent 31 years believing that real justice wasn't about punishment for its own sake. It was about the possibility of change. He extended her the same measured grace he'd shown her that night in the ballroom, not because she'd earned it, but because that was who he had always chosen to be. The story of the judge who worked as a waiter spread far beyond New York, picked up by local news stations and, Eventually, national outlets drawn to a story that felt, in a media landscape often crowded with outrage, genuinely uplifting. Solomon received invitations to speak, at law schools, at community centers, at churches throughout the city. He accepted only a handful, choosing carefully, always steering the conversation away from the incident itself and toward the values underneath it. The dignity of honest work, the danger of judging people by their circumstances, the quiet power of responding to cruelty with composure rather than matching it. At one of these talks, held at a community center in the Bronx where he'd volunteered for years, a young man in his early 20s approached him afterward. He introduced himself as Emmanuel, a community college student working nights as a security guard to pay his tuition, studying to become a paralegal. "Judge Reeves," Emmanuel said, a little nervously. "I saw the video. I just wanted to say, I get looked past like that almost every day. People walk by me at that building like I'm part of the furniture. Seeing you stand up there and not lose yourself, not get angry, but still make your point so clear. It meant something to me. It gave me something to hold on to." Solomon placed a hand on the young man's shoulder, the same steady, warm gesture he'd once used to comfort nervous young attorneys arguing their first case before his bench. "Emmanuel," he said, "you hold on to that feeling, not the anger, the clarity. There will be people in your life who look right through you because of what job you're doing or what you look like doing it. Let them be wrong about you. Your job is just to keep being right about yourself." He learned over the following weeks that Emmanuel had no family support system to speak of. His mother worked 2 jobs, and money for his textbooks and transportation was a constant strain. Quietly, without any announcement or public gesture, Solomon arranged through his old law school's alumni network to have Emmanuel's remaining tuition covered through the very scholarship fund Desmond Halloway had donated to. He never told Emmanuel where the funding had come from. He simply wanted the young man to keep going. As for the catering job, Solomon kept working it, once or twice a month, exactly as before. His employer, mortified by the incident and eager to retain him for the prestige his presence now brought their events, offered to promote him to a management position on the spot. Solomon declined, gently but firmly. "I don't do this work to manage anyone," he told the company's owner, smiling. "I do it because there's something honest about carrying a tray through a room, seeing people, being useful. I had 31 years of managing things. I'm not looking to go back to that." His daughter, Yolanda, visited him one Sunday afternoon a few months after the gala, finding him in his garden, tending to the roses his late wife, Adeline, had planted years before. "You know," she said, sitting on the porch steps, watching him work, "you could have sued that woman. You could have made her pay for what she did." Solomon straightened, wiping soil from his hands, and considered the question for a long moment, the way he considered everything. "I could have," he said, "but your mother used to say something to me, back when I was a young lawyer, angry at every injustice I saw in this city. She'd say, 'Solomon, don't let other people's smallness make you small too.' I've carried that with me my whole career. That woman tore my vest, baby girl. She didn't tear who I am. I wasn't about to let her have that kind of power over me." Yolanda smiled, shaking her head with the particular fondness reserved for a father who had, once again, managed to turn hardship into wisdom. "Mama would be proud of you," she said quietly. Solomon looked toward the roses, deep red and blooming despite the coolness settling into the autumn air, and nodded slowly. "I hope so," he said. "I try to be a man she'd still recognize." A year later, almost to the day, the Children's Hope Gala returned to the Whitmore Grand Ballroom. Solomon, now something of a quiet local legend, was invited not as staff this time, but as a guest of honor, seated at Vivian's own table, wearing a tailored charcoal suit that fit him the way only a well-made suit can. The irony was not lost on him, and when Vivian rose once more to address the crowd, she gestured for him to join her on stage, not to recount the story everyone in the room already knew by heart, but simply to help announce the launch of a new initiative. The Solomon Reeves Fellowship, a scholarship program designed specifically for young people working service jobs while pursuing higher education, funded in part, quietly and without fanfare, by a substantial anonymous donation that everyone in the room correctly suspected had come from a certain investment firm eager to make amends. As Solomon stood at the podium once more, looking out over a room full of people who now knew exactly who he was, he found himself thinking not of anger, not of vindication, but of his father, a man who had spent 38 years in a doorman's uniform, opening doors for people who rarely looked him in the eye, and who had, despite it all, raised a son who became a federal judge, who now stood in this very room reminding the wealthy and powerful that dignity was never about the uniform a person wore. "My father used to tell me," Solomon said, his voice carrying easily through the quiet ballroom, "that every person who walks through a door someone else opens for them owes that person more than a nod. They owe them recognition, real recognition, that the person holding that door is not beneath them, but simply standing in a different place along the same road we're all traveling." He looked out at the crowd, many of whom he now recognized from that night a year earlier, and allowed himself a small, warm smile. "Tonight, we're not just raising money for children who need it," he said. "We're raising something else too, a reminder that every person serving you a meal, opening your door, clearing your table, they are carrying their own hopes, their own struggles, their own quiet dignity, whether you take the time to see it or not." He paused, letting his gaze drift briefly toward the back of the room, where the evening's waitstaff stood along the wall, trays in hand, watching the proceedings with the particular stillness of people accustomed to being unseen. "I see you," he said simply, addressing them directly, his voice softening. "And I hope, after tonight, everyone in this room does too." The applause that followed was not loud or dramatic. It was steady, warm, and full, the sound of an entire room finally understanding something they should have known all along. And somewhere near the back wall, a young waitress, no older than 20, wiped a quiet tear from her cheek, and, for the first time in a long while, felt genuinely, unmistakably seen. If this story moved you, hit subscribe and turn on notifications. We bring you a brand new story of dignity, kindness, and unexpected justice every single week. And before you go, tell us in the comments, has a stranger's quiet grace ever changed how you saw the world? We read every one. See you in the next story.